Hello everybody, Toreno here, and today I'm going to look at some potential Dutch tanks that can be added to War Thunder. The Netherlands, or Holland as some people inaccurately call it, is a nation that has a surprisingly large number of tanks and other armoured vehicles to bring to the table, ranging from armoured cars, regular tanks, missile-armed vehicles, and one of my most anticipated tanks for being added to War Thunder. The Netherlands would likely be added to the French tech tree, potentially as a sub-tree, though individual vehicles to fill any gaps could work as well, and I hope to see some of these vehicles added to the game soon. So without further ado, let's look at some Dutch vehicles. Starting with armoured cars, the first vehicles we're looking at are the L181 and L180, or in Dutch service, Panzerwagen M36 and M38 respectively. These vehicles were brought from the Swedish company AB Landsverk, who sold these vehicles in many different configurations to many different nations, including Denmark, who brought the L180, which I covered in a previous video. We'll start by looking at what's the same about the L180 and L181 stats wise. Armament is a 37mm Bofors cannon with a penetration of 32mm at 500 metres at a 0° angle, which is pretty good for an armoured car. They are also armed with 3 Lewis machine guns. Armour was about 5 to 9mm, making these not particularly well protected, though this is less of an issue when engaging at longer ranges, which is more feasible with the 37mm gun's penetration characteristics. Max speed was around 70 km an hour or 43 miles per hour, making these pretty fast vehicles. And the crew complement was 5, with a front driver, rear driver, gunner, loader and commander. So as we can see, they are pretty similar on the face of it, so why the two different designations? What is different about the two armoured cars? Well, first of all, looking at the L181, we have a slightly smaller vehicle than the L180, being 5.6 metres long, 2 metres wide and 2.4 metres high, versus 5.8 metres high, 2.2 metres wide and 2.4 metres high for the L180. The L181 also only weighs 6 tonnes versus 8 tonnes for the L180. The next big difference is that the L181 has a smaller engine, providing only 80 horsepower, as opposed to the 160 horsepower for the L180, which explains the two vehicles having the same speed, despite a 2-tonne difference in weight. Another difference is that they are built on two different chassis, with the L181 built on a Daimler-Benz Type G3A/P chassis versus a Bussing NAG chassis for the L180. So where would I place these vehicles in War Thunder? I would think battle rating 1.3, as they both have a pretty good gun, able to do major damage to enemies, and high speed to escape major threats, though the thin armour can cause issues against most enemies, especially those with fast firing autocannons. The next vehicle is the Dutch developed M39 Panzerwagen. This was an attempt by the Dutch to reduce reliance on foreign vehicles, with this vehicle being produced domestically in the Netherlands by the DEF company. The M39 was armed with the same 37mm Bofors gun as the previous vehicles. Again, a pretty powerful gun for an armoured car, and again also had 3 Lewis machine guns. Armour was 10mm all around the front, side and rear of the car, with the bottom being 5mm, top 6mm and the turret 7.5mm thick. The armour is also somewhat sloped, improving protection. Max speed was 75 km an hour or 47 miles per hour. And the crew numbered 5, a front driver, rear driver, whole machine gunner, commander and gunner. Overall, I believe a battle rating of 1.3 would be a good place for this vehicle, for much the same reasons as the L180 and L181, as it has a decent gun, good speed, and has improved armour over the previous vehicles. Moving on, we now come to Dutch tanks. Now it should be pointed out that the Netherlands didn't produce these tanks, but was if not the biggest user of them. So in the event they are added to War Thunder, they would be best suited being added as Dutch vehicles. The first of these tanks is the Marmon Herrington CTMS ITB1, or Combat Tank Medium Series. This was armed with a 37mm gun and 4 machine guns, 1 coaxial and the rest mounted in the hull. Unfortunately, there is very little information on the 37mm gun, as this isn't the standard US M3 37mm gun as used by the US Army at the time. It is instead what is described as an automatic 37mm length 44 gun produced by the American Armament Corporation, which used its own proprietary ammunition loaded via a clip of 5 shells. Also, I'm not entirely sure if this is actually automatic or just semi-automatic, which is how it's described in test reports from the Aberdeen Proving Ground. This makes discerning an armour penetration somewhat difficult, nor is there any armour penetration tests to go from. The only information I've been able to find on this is a single forum post quoting from a catalogue or document stating that it was capable of 25mm penetration of hardened steel, quote, at all battle ranges and at a considerable angle of impact, end quote. The same post also says that muzzle velocity is about 565 meters a second. The muzzle velocity would put the gun roughly in the same ballpark as the SA-18 length 21 gun, or Type 94 as used on early French and Japanese tanks, and would on the face of it give a roughly similar penetration to that claimed in the aforementioned quote, at least at close range. Armour wasn't particularly great, consisting of bolted on plates of around 6 to 13mm, so barely adequate even against machine gun fire, not helped by the copious amounts of flat surfaces to help guarantee a penetration by almost any weapon. Speed was about 40 km an hour or 25 miles per hour, and crew complement was 3, a driver, commander/gunner in the turret, and a bow machine gunner. Overall, this would likely be placed at battle rating 1.0, as its armour is just laughably weak and the gun is barely adequate either. Though if the gun does turn out to be fully automatic, there could be some fun to be had with it. Now this next tank is probably the one I'm most excited to see. The MTLS is another tank by the Marmon Herrington Company and doesn't seem very much discussed despite one rather odd feature. Ladies and gentlemen, I present a tank with a double barrel armament. And no, this isn't a prototype or one-off. Over 125 of these were built. Seriously, this is a concept that seems to be quite popular on fictional tanks, and seems to have all the hallmarks of a meme weapon or tank, but I've rarely seen it brought up, which kind of surprised me when I found out about it while researching this topic. Unfortunately, despite being double-barrelled, it's the same 37mm gun as on the CTM-S, so despite double the firepower, it's still going to have poor armour penetration. On top of this, it is also armed with a grand total of 7 30 caliber machine guns, meaning this could probably be used as a makeshift AA tank if you're having trouble playing it as a regular tank. Armour is somewhat improved, being 38mm at the front, reducing to 13mm elsewhere on the tank, though it still has a lot of flat surfaces, obviously making this easier to penetrate than sloped armour. Speed was, as with the CTM-S, about 40 km an hour or 25 miles per hour. Crew complement was 4, though I've not been able to find out where they would be stationed. One would assume a driver, gunner, commander and bow machine gunner, but this is just speculation on my part. Now, having stated the on-paper stats, in real life this thing was awful. Basically, when this tank was tested at the Aberdeen Testing Ground in 1943, it was basically useless. The gun didn't work, the tracks fell off, it was difficult to service, and was condemned as unfit for service in the United States military, who had taken over these tanks after the fall of the Dutch East Indies. In the end, the tanks taken over by the Americans were scrapped. A few did make it to the Dutch Western colonies, but they didn't see any combat, and they were mostly scrapped or left to rust and fall apart from lack of parts. Nicholas Moran, or the Chieftain, once made a video considering this as the worst tank ever made, which should give a hint on how bad it was. So why have it in War Thunder? Well, for one, as I've mentioned in previous videos, all tanks work exactly as intended. Breakdowns aren't a thing, gun failures don't exist, and if it was capable of doing something if kept in peak condition, then it will be able to do so in game with no issues. The other major problem of it being obsolete is also less of an issue, as due to the battle rating system, it will be facing tanks it will actually be capable of beating. I personally think a battle rating of 1.3 would be the best place for this tank, as its gun will at least have a slim chance of doing some damage. Its armour is now somewhat improved, and I could see this tank having some popularity, if only due to the uniqueness of its main armament. Our next vehicle is one I've talked about before and is indeed already in War Thunder under the name M4A5, but is actually called the Ram tank, a tank developed by Canada during World War II. The tank was never used as a combat tank during the war, but afterwards many were handed over to the Netherlands, having been rearmed with the British 75mm gun, replacing the 6-pounder 57mm gun it was originally armed with. Armour would be mostly the same as in game, though in later models the machine gun turret fitted to the hull was replaced with a regular ball mount, and there might possibly be changes to the gun mantlet, but for the most part will remain at around 38 to 88mm thick. Max speed was 40 km an hour or 25 miles per hour, while crew complement was 5, a driver, gunner, loader, commander and bow machine gunner. I believe this tank should be added at around battle rating 3.3, This is lower than the M4A5 already in game, which I believe is 3.7, but that tank is armed with a 6-pounder 57mm gun, which has better penetration than the 75mm gun. So like with the British tanks 75mm gun variant, this tank will be lower than its 57mm gun variant, i.e. the M4A5. We now come to the Dutch vehicles that could be loosely filed away under modern tank destroyers. These vehicles are armed with anti-tank missiles, firmly putting them in the modern era. The first of these is the YP408 PWAT, or Panzerveer anti-tank. The YP408 was a Dutch armoured personnel carrier, with the PWAT converted to be armed with a TOW missile launcher. Now, there's about 5 different TOW missiles in War Thunder. I'm going to go with the assumption this would use the same missiles as on the M113s already in game, the 71B or 71C ITOW missiles, given a penetration of 430mm and 600mm respectively. Armour is thin, being around 6 to 16mm, so this is definitely a vehicle that needs to be kept far away from other enemies. Max speed is 61 km an hour or 38 miles per hour, and the crew complement is 4: driver, gunner, commander and loader. Overall, I think a battle rating of about 8.0 would be a good place for this, placing it about the same battle rating as the M113 TOW armed vehicles already in the game. The next vehicle is a somewhat interesting counterpart to the previous and future vehicles, this being the NECAF Jeep. This was essentially a Willys M38A1 Jeep, constructed in the 1950s, with the NECAF being an almost identical version assembled in the Netherlands. The only difference being additional lighting and reflectors to comply with Dutch traffic regulations. These were armed at first with M40 recoilless rifles, giving a penetration of 433mm with heat rounds. However, they were later armed with TOW missile launchers, giving a much improved standoff range, as well as increased penetration. Armour as expected of a Jeep is non-existent, making this an extremely exposed vehicle, having to rely on speed and its smaller size to conceal itself. Max speed would be around 96 km an hour or 60 miles per hour, while crew complement would be 2 to 4, a driver, commander and possibly a gunner and loader. I think this would be best placed at battle rating 6.7 when armed with the recoilless rifle, and around 8.0 when armed with the TOW missile launcher. I think this would be quite an interesting ambush vehicle, having to hide from enemies before destroying them with well-placed shells and missiles, and would be an interesting vehicle to play in War Thunder. Next, we have the YPR-765 PRAT, or Panzerupps anti-tank, an IFV developed by the FMC Corporation as the armoured fighting infantry vehicle, but sold in a large number of countries, with the Netherlands being one of the main users of these under the designation YPR-765. As with the 2 previous vehicles, this variant of the YPR-765 is armed with a TOW missile launcher, again giving it a penetration of around 430 to 600mm, though with modern missiles this may go up to 800mm. Also slightly differently, this is a twin-mounted missile launcher, so already we've got a bit more of an increase in firepower there. I've not been able to find an armour value for this vehicle, but no doubt it would be only able to protect against small arms or very low calibre weapons. Max speed is 61 km an hour or 38 miles per hour, while crew complement is 4, made up of a driver, commander, gunner and loader. I would place this vehicle around battle rating 8.7 to 9.0, as we now have the possibility of improved missiles, making this a much more deadly vehicle than its predecessors. The last of the anti-tank missile-armed vehicles is the Fennec, a reconnaissance vehicle developed by both the Germans and the Dutch. This vehicle can be fitted with a Spike anti-tank missile, which gives around 700 to 800mm of penetration, and I believe also has a tandem warhead for use against vehicles fitted with ERA. Max speed is 115 km an hour or 71 miles per hour, making this a very fast vehicle. And the crew complement for the regular Fennec is 3, a driver, gunner and radio operator, though it's possible there would be a loader when fitted with a missile launcher. I would place this around a battle rating of 9.3 to 9.7, as we now have some truly advanced missiles mated to an extremely fast vehicle, meaning this would be perfect for shoot and scoot situations while still making a very good ambush vehicle. We now come to the Dutch self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicles, of which unfortunately there aren't that many. We will be starting with the Brut Overvalwagen, an armoured personnel carrier with this variant converted to a self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicle. The variant we are looking at is armed with one 12.7mm machine gun and 4 7.7mm machine guns. Armour is around 6 to 20mm, making this fairly protected for what kind of vehicle it is. Max speed is around 90 kilometers an hour or 55 miles per hour, while crew complement would be around 2 to 3, a driver, gunner and possibly a commander. I would place this about battle rating 1.3, as it is fairly well armed for anti-aircraft work, while its 12.7mm machine gun might still be dangerous to some early tanks. Lastly, we come to a vehicle that we've already looked at, the Fennec. Stats are pretty much the same, except in the AA configuration it is armed with 4 Stinger missiles, making this well armed for anti-aircraft work. I would place this at battle rating 9.3, which is pretty similar to other vehicles with this type of armament, so it should be well placed to do some damage here. So that brings us to the end of this episode looking at Dutch tanks. All in all, I think we have quite a few good and interesting vehicles here, enough for a small sub-tree or to help fill in any gaps in the French tech tree. I'd like to hear in the comments if you're looking forward to any of the vehicles I've covered today. Personally, I would love to see the MTLS, as it is a very unique vehicle that we don't really have anything like in game. So, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.